At 3:04 a.m., two men were hanging off the side of a federal prison, and the only reason they were still alive was because nobody bothered to look up. 17 stories above a quiet Chicago street in freezing December, their bodies scraped against raw concrete as a rope made from torn bedsheets and braided dental floss cut into their hands slick with blood. This was not a movie stunt, not a drill, not a fantasy of freedom whispered in a prison cell. This was real, and it was already going wrong. The man lower on the rope, Jose Banks, had been sentenced just 5 days earlier to 80 years in federal prison, a sentence so long it erased the idea of a future. Above him was Kenneth Conley facing decades of his own. They were not supposed to be here. The Metropolitan Correctional Center was designed to make this moment impossible. No bars to saw through, no glass to break, just a 5-inch concrete slit where a human body could never fit, at least that was the theory. For decades, that assumption held, until tonight. As the rope rubbed against the building's edge, fibers began to tear one by one, barely audible over the wind. A single slip would mean a fall of more than 170 feet onto solid pavement, and yet below them, the city kept breathing. Cars passed, lights changed, no alarms, no shouting, no one looked up. What you're about to hear isn't just the story of an escape. It's the story of how systems fail quietly, how patience outperforms force, and how freedom, real freedom, often lasts only minutes longer than the illusion that you ever had it at all. By the time Banks and Conley were already halfway down the building, the prison still believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Inside, cell 17162 inmates lay in their bunks, motionless, breathing slow, wrapped in blankets under the dull, fluorescent glow. At least that's what the system recorded. What the guards saw during the 10 p.m. head count were bodies, shapes under sheets, familiar silhouettes that matched expectation. The flashlight beam swept past the narrow door window, lingered for less than a second, and moved on. No one leaned closer. No one questioned it, because nothing in that moment felt unusual. And that was the point. Banks and Conley didn't beat the prison with speed or force. They beat it with normalcy. Hours earlier, they had carefully constructed decoys using their own clothes and spare sheets, stuffing and shaping them until they mimicked the quiet weight of sleeping men. Small details mattered: a fabric fold that suggested a shoulder, a shadow that looked like an arm draped over the bunk. In dim light through reinforced glass, it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to confirm what the guard already believed. When the footsteps faded down the tier, the cell remained silent. But the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with time. Time bought by routine. Time created by a system that runs on repetition instead of attention. The prison wasn't alert because it had no reason to be. Every night followed the same script, same walk, same count, same assumption that nothing ever changes. That assumption is where the escape truly began. Long before concrete cracked or ropes were tied, the prison had already failed, not through negligence, but through confidence. Confidence that procedure equals security. Confidence that design replaces vigilance. As Banks and Conley waited, listening to the building settle into its overnight rhythm, they understood something most people never see. Systems don't collapse with noise. They collapse quietly when everyone believes they're still working. The Metropolitan Correctional Center was never meant to be dramatic. It wasn't built to intimidate or inspire fear. It was built to function, to remove chaos through design. Its architects believed that if you eliminated obvious weaknesses, escape would eliminate itself. No barred windows, no glass panes, no theatrical obstacles. Instead, there was concrete, thick, reinforced, and unyielding, and within it, a narrow vertical slit, just 5 inches wide. Not a window in the traditional sense, but an opening for light and air. Smaller than a human head. Smaller than possibility. The logic was elegant and brutally simple. If a man cannot fit through the opening, then escape is not a matter of courage or creativity. It is a physical impossibility. For years, that logic held. The prison's reputation rested on it. Guards trusted it. Administrators trusted it. And slowly, dangerously, they stopped questioning it. What no one accounted for was time. Banks and Conley had plenty of it. Day after day, they stared at that slit in the wall, not as a barrier, but as a challenge. They ran their fingers over the concrete, felt its texture, its flaws, its age. Concrete looks permanent, but it isn't alive. It doesn't adapt. Given enough patience, it can be persuaded to fail. The prison's greatest strength, its confidence in design, became its blind spot. There were no alarms on the walls, no sensors in the concrete. The assumption was that no one would even try, and that assumption became permission. Each night, the building settled into the same rhythm doors, locking footsteps, fading fluorescent lights humming. And each night, that 5-inch slot remained unchanged, unquestioned, silently waiting. Banks and Conley understood something essential systems don't protect against imagination. They protect against repetition. The prison wasn't watching the walls because the walls had never mattered before. It was watching people behavior noise. It never imagined the threat would come from silence, from inches gained over months, from hands working patiently where no one thought to look. This wasn't a failure of steel or concrete. It was a failure of belief. A belief that architecture could replace attention, that rules could replace awareness. As the men prepared to exploit that narrow opening, they weren't just planning an escape. They were testing a far more dangerous idea that anything declared impossible and left unquestioned long enough eventually invites someone desperate enough to prove it wrong. Breaking the wall was never about brute force. It was about discipline under pressure. Banks and Conley understood immediately that one reckless strike would end everything. Concrete doesn't fail quietly. One sharp crack echoing down the tier would bring guards' questions, searches, and the hole would become evidence instead of an exit. So they worked the way surgeons operate, not the way criminals usually do. They scavenged what the prison itself provided, a heavy metal component, taken piece by piece from a floor buffer dense enough to act as a hammer. Fragments of hard material repurposed into crude chisels. Nothing that looked like a weapon. Nothing that couldn't be hidden under clothing during routine movement. The real challenge wasn't breaking concrete, it was breaking it without being heard. They studied the building's rhythms the way gamblers study odds. Mealtimes when food carts rattled down corridors. Shift changes when doors slammed and voices overlapped. Those were their windows. 3 strikes, sometimes 4. Then they stopped. They listened. Every pause felt longer than the blows themselves. Every second carried the risk that footsteps would stop outside their door. Progress came in millimeters, not inches. Chips flaked off slowly, frustratingly, as if the wall itself resisted surrender. But the debris was as dangerous as the noise. A single grain of concrete dust left on the floor could trigger suspicion. So they collected everything, every shard, every powdery trace, and flushed it down the toilet, watching months of effort vanish down a pipe in seconds. The wall began to change, but it couldn't look changed. That required another layer of deception. They ground concrete dust into fine powder and mixed it with toothpaste and soap, smearing the paste over the damaged surface after each session. Under fluorescent light, the color matched well enough. From a distance, it looked untouched. Weeks passed. Then, months. The hole grew large enough to compromise the steel reinforcement rods embedded inside the concrete. Removing them was agonizing. Steel didn't chip, it fought back. Each adjustment took time, patience, and nerve. When the final block came loose, they didn't celebrate. They froze. An opening big enough for a man now existed where none was supposed to. But exposure meant discovery. The vertical security bars inside the window frame were non-negotiable. If they disappeared, the illusion collapsed. So they built replacements. Cardboard flattened and shaped. Paper towel cores cut and aligned. Pencil graphite rubbed in until the surface reflected just enough gray to suggest metal. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. From the hallway through reinforced glass, it looked real enough. The genuine steel bars were shoved deep into their mattresses, buried where inspections never reached. By the time the hole was complete, the prison still believed its most important assumption, that no one could fit through a 5-inch gap. Banks and Conley had already disproven it in silence. Now the wall was gone. What remained was height, and the knowledge that everything they had built could still end with a single mistake. Long after the hole in the wall was finished, long after the prison's central assumption had already collapsed, one problem remained that even Banks and Conley couldn't ignore. They were 17 stories up, more than 170 feet above solid concrete, and gravity doesn't negotiate. Jumping wasn't an option. Hesitation wasn't either. They needed a rope, and not the kind that looks convincing in movies, but one that could hold 2 adult men in winter wind without snapping. Inside, a federal prison rope doesn't exist. You can't order it, can't request it, can't explain having it without ending everything. The solution had to be invisible, ordinary, something so harmless it would never trigger suspicion. That's when they landed on the answer investigators would later struggle to believe: dental floss. It was issued, freely replenished, without question, dismissed as trivial hygiene. One strand breaks easily, but Banks and Conley weren't thinking in strands. They were thinking in volume, in physics, in distribution of weight. Hundreds of strands braided together become something else entirely. Stronger, relentless. They began collecting floss, quietly asking for more, trading with other inmates, coiling it tight and hiding it deep inside mattresses where hands never searched. Bedsheets followed, torn into long strips, their fabric reinforced inch by inch with layers of floss wrapped, threaded, and pulled tight. This wasn't improvisation. It was manufacturing under surveillance. They worked only at night, stopping instantly at unfamiliar sounds, building the rope in 10-foot sections because anything longer couldn't be concealed. Every knot was tested by force, by fear, by the knowledge that one failure wouldn't mean falling, it would mean vanishing. Their fingers cramped, their hands blistered. But they kept going because the rope wasn't just a tool anymore. It was commitment. Once it existed, there was no turning back. By late November, nearly 200 feet of reinforced line lay hidden in pieces beneath their bunks. Strong enough, they hoped. Strong enough was the most dangerous phrase of all, because hope doesn't stop gravity. And when the night finally came, that rope would either rewrite the rules of the prison or become the last mistake they ever made. The moment they committed to the descent, everything became irreversible. There was no pause button, no safe retreat back through the wall, no margin for correction. As Banks eased himself over the edge, the rope immediately began to move in ways they hadn't fully anticipated, pulled outward by the winter wind scraping hard against the concrete lip of the window. The friction was constant, unforgiving. With every inch downward, the fabric fibers strained, stretching past what they were ever designed to hold. Banks felt the burn first, then the pain, then the numbness, as skin tore from his palms and blood soaked into the makeshift rope, turning it slick and unpredictable. 17 stories below the street looked unreal, like a flat image rather than something capable of killing him. The wind surged again, swinging the rope sideways, slamming his body into the wall, knocking the air from his lungs. Above him, Conley felt the same violent pull, each movement transferring force through the line, making the entire system shudder. Then came the sound. Neither of them could ignore a soft ripping, almost polite, as individual threads began to give way where the rope rubbed against concrete. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was slow. Banks looked down. Still more than 50 feet to go. His fingers slipped, and for a fraction of a second, gravity took over. 6 inches vanished beneath him before he caught himself, heart exploding in his chest. The rope swung harder now, reacting to panic, to wind, to weight. Blood made gripping harder, cold erased sensation. Every movement was guesswork. Then headlights appeared below, sweeping across the pavement, as a car turned onto the street at exactly the wrong moment. Banks froze, suspended between falling and being seen. If the driver glanced up even briefly, everything would collapse at once. The car passed, the light moved on. The light moved. The city remained indifferent. 20 feet. 10. The tearing sound grew louder, threads snapping one by one, but there was no time to slow down. Banks dropped the final distance, and his feet hit concrete with a force that nearly buckled his legs. He stayed upright. Alive. Conley followed seconds later, sliding the last stretch, landing beside him. They stood there in the cold, shaking, bleeding, breathing air that tasted unreal. For a moment, nothing else existed. Against every assumption built into that prison, they had survived the descent. They had beaten gravity, wind, concrete, and time itself. And they didn't yet know how little that victory would ultimately mean. Freedom lasted only as long as the prison needed to wake up. At 7 a.m., Daylight exposed what darkness had hidden, bedsheets dangling down the side of the building, swaying slightly in the morning air. The illusion collapsed instantly. Alarms followed procedure, and procedure handed the case to federal authorities. Banks made the mistake that feels human. In hindsight, he stayed close to what he knew, hiding in Chicago, in a neighborhood that still felt familiar. Familiarity masqueraded as safety. 2 days later, agents surrounded the apartment and took him in without resistance. Conley lasted longer, 17 days of disguises, slow movement, borrowed anonymity, but the city noticed patterns long before it noticed ropes. When he ran, instinct betrayed him. Officers closed the distance, and the escape ended where it always does, on the street under open sky. The irony was merciless. They had defeated concrete and height, but time reclaimed them effortlessly. The system corrected itself not with drama, but with speed. In the end, the escape didn't expose a weak prison so much as a familiar truth about how systems really fail. The wall was repaired, procedures were revised, and new assurances were quietly put in place. But the deeper lesson remained untouched. Banks and Conley didn't overcome steel or concrete through force. They slipped through the space created by assumption, routine, and belief that impossibility is permanent. Their freedom lasted days. Their sentences now last decades, and the trade-off was absolute. What remains is the uncomfortable reminder that systems built on habit don't collapse with noise, they erode silently, one unchallenged assumption at a time. The story isn't about escaping prison. It's about how patience, focus, and desperation can briefly outpace even the most confident designs, and how the cost of that brief victory is almost always paid in full later. This story isn't just about an escape. It's a warning. Systems don't usually fail because someone attacks them head-on. They fail because everyone assumes they no longer need to be questioned. Habit replaces attention. Confidence replaces vigilance. And eventually someone patient enough finds the gap. For viewers, the lesson goes beyond prisons. Whether it's institutions, careers, or personal routines, anything left on autopilot becomes vulnerable. Progress and protection comes from awareness, not assumption. If this story made you think differently about how systems really work, take a second to support the channel. Like the video, share it with someone who values critical thinking, and subscribe for more true stories that expose how the world actually breaks and why it matters.